Welcome to the Radiant Visalia podcast. Join us at one of our two services, 9 a.m. and 10:45 a.m. Download the Church Center app or visit our website, radiantvisalia.com, to stay connected with us. All right, enjoy.
There is a heavenly city that I'm compelled to find.
Well, Happy New Year. I know it's the 8th of the month, but since it's the first time we've actually gathered corporately, I think I can still say Happy New Year, so happy 2017. You know, this time of year often comes with a list of all kinds of good intentions or resolutions or ideas or plans for improving our lives in the coming year. How many of you have some kind of resolutions or goals that you've set for this year as you're going into it? How many of you are not going to raise your hand because you're embarrassed that you have some kind of resolution? Yeah, there's some of you, I bet. Well, you might have hopes for changes like in your physical health, you know, whether you're wanting to eat better or work out more regularly. That was kind of part of my kind of goals for the year. I had this plan for working out more regularly, and I was going to really hit it hard at the beginning of the year by working out almost every day in January, and I made it through one day. We went to the gym, and I took my wife with me, of course. Why not do that together? Of all times for my wife to be at the gym with me. That doesn't happen a whole lot. So we go to the gym and work out, and basically you already heard what happened. I passed out, not once, but twice, right at the front desk as I was getting ready to leave. I'd already finished working out, and I knew I was lightheaded and knew I'd kind of overdone it, but I thought I can get through this. I can muscle through this. So I'm talking to him at the front desk, and I say, I think I need to put my head down on the counter. And I put my head on the counter, and Kathleen goes, "What are you doing?" And that was the last thing I remember. And I wake up, of all things, to my wife doing CPR on me and yelling, "Call 911." And I wake up, and I was having a pretty good dream already. It wasn't the gates of heaven, but I was I was playing racquetball or something in my dreams. It was great. And I'm going "Why are you waking me up yelling at me, honey?" And she's yelling, "Call 911. And then when I wake up and realize what happened, I'm looking around, and there's 30 people. I'm right at the entrance to In Shape. And there's 30 people standing there. There's some of my racquetball buddies standing there going, "Dude, are you okay?" I'm going, "Oh my gosh." I said, "Hey, why don't you guys get me up, or I don't want to be sitting here in the entrance." So the guy runs and grabs a chair. He brings out a stool this high with the back on it and no arms. And I'm looking at it, and I kind of thought this may not be the best, but I wasn't totally clear. I was kind of embarrassed. And so they put me up on the stool. I don't remember anything after that. I passed out again. And by this time, Kathleen is really panicked. And so second time I wake up after 5 seconds, and I see Kim Rico hugging Kathleen, praying for her, and I'm going "Oh my gosh." And the guy everybody, and I hear him on the microphone, "Code blue." We're not in the hospital, we're at In Shape, right? And they say, "Code blue, every employee to the front desk." I'm going, "Oh my Lord, this is the worst day of my life." Anyway, the story's too long and too embarrassing for me to go into more. I was fine, got to the hospital, got to have 6 hours in the ER after my first ever ambulance ride, which they forced me to do, wouldn't let me back out of it since I'd passed out twice. And so spent 6 hours, and they did every test in the world, said, "Man, you have a really strong heart, you're really healthy, you're dehydrated and overexerted and whatever." So anyway, my New Year's goals and resolutions didn't start off too good. I hope yours do better. You might have other kinds of goals for this year that may be some relational goals, like you may have some hopes to be a little more intentional about your marriage. You may have some goals to spend a little more quality time as a family or with your children. You might want to make a higher priority of friendships in your life, or you may have some personal goals. You may want to read more. You may want to read a book a month, or you may want to get on a budget And so you can get out of debt, start working to get out of debt, or you might have some spiritual goals as you started this year. You might want to read through the Bible in a year. Some people I've heard some folks talking about doing that, or just get more time in the Word, or more time with Jesus personally in your times with the Lord, or you may want to get more involved in our church community and church life and family, or be more consistent in tithing. Whatever. There's a lot of great ideas for self-improvement and for improving our lives that are genuinely some good ideas. It was interesting at the beginning, or in December, as I had a few conversations with folks about some things I was thinking of doing. I was stirred up by almost everything everybody else was talking about doing. I almost wanted to get on board with all of their goals, and it's not a bad thing to have some goals and some intentions as we look at our lives. Now, some of you here may be looking at it going like, I'm not really into New Year's resolutions. I think that's kind of weird and superstitious, and honestly, there's no magical, special thing about January 1 where we should all make New Year's resolutions or goals. There's nothing magical about that, so I totally get that. But it is a healthy thing to periodically assess your life and to look to make changes and adjustments. That's a healthy thing. That's not a bad thing at all, to periodically look at what's going on in your life and where it's heading and say, hey, is this going the way I'm hoping it would go? And to make adjustments and changes where you have a desire to. You know, we as a church family, we do that. We as a church, we regularly look at kind of the life and the health of our church body, and then we try to make plans accordingly. And we do things like this financial weekend intensive that's coming up in January. That's part of our hope for this new year, is to provide ways, some things that can, some plans, some events that can help us be more healthy individually and as a family. We also have a couple of weekend intensives that we're trying to put on the calendar for the next few months, maybe one on marriage, maybe one on parenting. So it's not a bad thing to be able to kind of have a list of hopes, some ideas, some desires to have some changes. I guess the question that I want to voice to you today is, in the midst of all the good things that we could put on our list, in the midst of all this list of things that we could improve in our lives, what should have top billing? What should move to the number one slot? Now, I recognize that I'm saying this in church on a Sunday morning, so there's an automatic answer that we all have, right? Jesus. You know, that comes out. The Bible, God, the church, something. You know, it reminds me of when our kids were in Sunday school, and they would come home, and, you know, in Sunday school, it's like, who really loves you? Mommy and Daddy? No, but who really loves you? My doggy? No, who really, really, really loves you? Jesus loves you. Oh, Jesus. And so it's like we raise our kids that the answer all the time when you get a question like that is Jesus. And I remember a story of some friends when we were younger that they went out camping and they were going to prepare their kids for what they were going to see when they went camping. They said, okay, there's going to be this fuzzy thing up in the tree. It has a big bushy tail. What do you think that thing is? And their son yells, Jesus! I said, no, not Jesus. It's a squirrel. It's a squirrel. So, yeah. I totally get that we kind of have these knee-jerk responses, and I'm not going to say that's not the right answer for today, but I want to just say that I want to encourage you to engage your mind as we look at what is the answer to this, because Jesus was asked this exact question. The question I just posed to you about what should come to the top of the list, what should have top rank, top billing on your list, Jesus was asked that question, and I'd like you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 22. And I'm going to read from verse 34 through 40, so you can follow along. Matthew 22 says, when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in all of the law? Okay, basically saying, what's top of the list? What needs to rank up at the top? What's most important here? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and the first commandment. And the second one is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Now, I want to acknowledge that, sadly, this is not a hungry group of disciples that's asking Jesus the question. It's not a group of disciples that are saying, man, we want to follow you, Jesus. What's most important? If you look at the context of these few verses, this is a group of people trying to trap Jesus. It's a group of Jews that are they know what's going on with the Word, they know what's going on with the law, and they've got their system set up. And if you glance right over at verse 15, it says, the Pharisees went out and plotted how to entangle Jesus in his words. And they ask him a question. And when Jesus responds to their question about taxes, it says at the end in verse 22, when all the people heard it, they marveled and they walked away from him. So then they kind of tag out. They tag out and the Sadducees come in with the next question. And the Sadducees ask him in these next few verses a question about the resurrection and marriage. And Jesus brings them an answer, and after his response in verse 33 it says, and when the crowd heard it, the entire group was astonished at his teachings. And so like these guys are trying to trip him up, and Jesus' response every time like blows their minds, and they're shocked by it. Well then, what happens as the Sadducees are quieted, the Pharisees say, okay, we're going to take another shot at this, and we're going to use our really big guns now. We're going to use the lawyer in our midst that's a Pharisee. If anybody could entangle somebody in their words, it's going to be the lawyer that's also a Pharisee. Sorry, Josh, if you're here, I apologize for that. So that's kind of the context of what's going on here. The Pharisees come together, they have a lawyer, they put him out there and they say, what's the greatest commandment? What ranks top? So these guys are really not hungry to know the right answer, but we are, right? I'm hungry to know the right answer. I'm hungry to hear Jesus' response. So let's read it with that kind of a heart. And Jesus' response to what matters most, to what should get the top billing, to what should take number one on our list is really almost so simple that you want to read past it. He says, love God. Love God with all that you are, with your whole heart, with your whole soul, with your whole mind, with all your being. You know, I'm not going to go and unpack each one of these things, but it just means with everything that you are. Not just with your Sunday morning time, not just with an emotional thing, but have your head involved in this, have your heart, your soul, your whole being involved in loving God. Do that with all that you are. And then he says, that's the greatest and the first commandment. Now, the greatest, that's pretty easy for us to unpack, right? Greatest, it just means it's the most important. It's the weightiest. It should have the highest priority. That one's pretty easy. But when he says it's the first commandment, that can be a little confusing because first can mean a couple things for us, right, in our culture. First can mean number one rank, right? Like you've worked your way to the top. But first can also mean the first one that came along, like your first child was born first. So that's why they're your first child. And when Jesus is talking here and say this is the first commandment, he's not talking about the chronological first. And the reason I know that is because Jesus is actually quoting out of Deuteronomy 6 right here. And what Jesus is quoting, he's quoting what all these Jews, every Jew standing around Jesus right now, had heard these verses, and most of them recited this exact phrase every day. The phrase is out of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. I'm going to read you the whole part of it. It says this, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Now, as I mentioned, all the Jews listening were actually very familiar with this passage because of what they did with it daily. Does anybody here know what that passage is actually called? The Shema. It's called the Shema. So any practicing Jew recited the Shema every day of their lives. Once they were old enough to learn it, which had happened pretty young, they would recite the Shema as a part of their prayers and reciting scriptures before God. So every day, every practicing Jew would recite exactly what Jesus had said to them. So when Jesus' response, when they said, what's the number one commandment? What's first? And he comes back with that. They've all heard this, but Jesus did something really pretty profound. He elevated this command right up to the very top. There'd been a lot of commands and laws that had come before the Shema was given. The 10 Commandments came before the Shema. All kinds of laws through the book of Leviticus. And as these Jews are standing there in this day, in the days of Jesus, they say there's something like 400 commands and laws and traditions that a practicing Jew had yoked on their shoulders that they had to work through. And what Jesus did when he said, here's the number one, because you know, even though they were trying to trip him up, you got to know that these Jews that were listening were going, I wonder what he's going to say is the most important thing. I wonder if it's that thing that I'm doing really good. You know, that one thing I got down, I hope it's mine. Come on, let that be number one. And Jesus says, here it is. Love God with all that you are. He moves it to the very top. So first here refers to priority. It refers to having the top spot, the top billing. Jesus elevates loving God above all these other 400 plus laws and traditions and commandments that these Jews were trying to walk under. And when I think of what these Jews were yoked with, the gospel is beautiful. You know, when Jesus, in Matthew chapter 11, he says, come to me. Come to me, you who are burdened down. Who's burdened down? We're all burdened down, but the Jews were really burdened down. The yoke that they were carrying, and that was kind of the phrase in that day for a Jew, they would walk under the yoke of their rabbi's teaching. It was what they would kind of take on their lives. So when Jesus turns and says, come to me, you that are burdened down and weary, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke on you. Remove your yoke, your heavy yoke. Take my yoke on you and learn from me, and you'll live. The invitation is to take off this yoke of all these commandments and dues that you've got to perform and take on the simple yoke of Jesus that is, hey, love God with all that you are. Love God. It's going to make everything else work out. Love God with everything that you are. Jesus goes on in this passage and he adds a second thing to it. He says, also of second importance now is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so he moved it way up the list as well for every practicing Jew of the day. So basically, first place, love God with your whole heart. Secondly, love others. And do you see what God's doing? Jesus is pointing at the heart. You know, here's these Pharisees and Sadducees. They've got their list of commands and do's and don'ts, which I have my list of commands and do's and don'ts. You know, I've been following Jesus for a long time, and all of that time have been in the church. And so over those years and decades, long years, I've acquired quite a list of do's and don'ts in my life. We all have some of that. And what Jesus is saying here is, hey, you know what? Scratch off the first place thing and move this to the very top. Move to the very top of your list. Love God with everything in you. Move it up there to the very top. You'll have life. He's putting his finger on our motivation. What is the anchor inside of us? There may be lists and there may be plans that we have for doing things, but what anchors your life? What anchors my life? And Jesus is saying, let this be the anchor that comes out. Love for God. Wholehearted, full. I want you to glance with me at verse 40 because I think it says something pretty profound about why we should have loving God as the number one place in our lives. Verse 40 says, very simply, it says, on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So what is that really saying? What is Jesus saying here? On these two commandments rely all the law and the prophets. In the NIV, it says all the law and prophets hang on these two things. In the Message, it says these two are pegs that everything else in God's kingdom is supported by. And I believe what Jesus is saying here is absolutely profound and really kind of revolutionary, because it kind of takes loving God as a first place priority out of the context of just we ought to do that or we should do that to this is why we should do this. Because it influences everything else in our lives. If we come into a place in our lives where we are loving God fully and wholeheartedly, everything else in our lives is influenced and affected by it. It's changed. So we don't have to just run around changing all these other things. We love God with all that we are. We give ourselves fully to loving God, and it affects everything else. It changes everything else. It even says on the flip side of that if we're not loving God fully as a priority in our lives, that all our oughts and our shoulds, all of our list of things that we're trying to do, it says they're going to fall flat. It says they're not going to hang out. They're not going to make it. If loving God and loving others is not a significant part of our commitment, then all the other things we try to do, it says it falls flat. It reminds me a little bit of what Paul says to the Galatian church. In Galatians chapter 5, I think it's verse 6, he says, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Now, that's a pretty bold statement. The only thing that counts. So that means, man, I've got mighty faith. I've walked out some incredible miracles. I've got great giftings. I've got a really sacrificial heart. I'm ready to do whatever it takes for you. Love's not involved. Doesn't count. Isn't that crazy? The only thing that counts. Faith expressed through love. If love's not in the equation, it just kind of like cancels it out. It doesn't count. Now, I think that's a good thing for all of us to take note of, but for people like me, I'm a task-oriented guy. I don't do this anymore, but I used to look for those little things that had to-do lists that had boxes where you could get it and you could fill it out. And I just make my own boxes because I couldn't find the one that had enough boxes on it. But I like making lists. I have quite a bit of energy, except for the very first day that I worked out of this year. I have quite a bit of energy, and I rest and kind of recuperate by doing things. That's just kind of how I am, and it drives my wife crazy. You know, like my favorite position for watching a movie is to stand up and to walk around. And so I can't do that in the theaters, but at home, like I'm always standing up and walking around, and that's just part of me. That's part of who I am. And for task-oriented people like me, there's some of you in this room that are kind of task-oriented. I want you to hear verse 40 big time, because this really is important for folks like us. Because what it says that if love is not the motivation and in the equation of our lives, none of our to-do things that we get accomplished count. That doesn't mean when you fix the garbage disposal, that doesn't count. But in the kind of the wider perspective of life, if we live our lives just doing tasks and going through the motions and getting things done, working things out, and the motivation is askew, love's not there, it cancels out what we're trying to do. So for task-oriented people like me, like when I read this passage the very first time, I didn't catch it. But over the years, as I've read this and let this sink into my heart, this grabs my heart. Because I can easily do the tasks without having my heart connected. I can easily just kind of walk through the stuff. I've been involved in ministry for over 40 years. And in that time, I've enjoyed it. I've loved it. I still love it. But in that time, it has become easy for me, if I'm not intentional about it and keeping my heart involved, I can start doing the tasks of ministry and not be doing it out of a response of loving God or loving people. And it doesn't turn out to fruit and life in me. I honestly don't think it does elsewhere either. I don't think it really does in other people either, but it doesn't turn out to be fruitful and life-giving in me. I've got to stay connected with loving God. Loving God. Unless love is behind it and anchoring it, my deeds fall flat. Isn't that part of the beauty of the gospel? You know, that Jesus, when he came to say that it doesn't rest on your achievements and my achievements to get our salvation, but that's not where it stops. That's not where the beauty of the gospel stops, because it also means that it doesn't rest on my achievements and my deeds and my tasks to keep my Christian life going. As I'm looking to follow Jesus for the rest of my life, it's not, Mark, run around and do all these tasks and do all these things. Jesus comes to simplify it and make it profoundly different than that. He says, do this. Love me with all that you are. Love me with everything that you have and everything that you are, and I think it's going to affect everything else. Isn't that what verse 40 says? There's going to be other changes that come, but make it a priority to love me with all that you are, with a whole heart, and I'll change the rest of it. You know, sometimes in the church, because I think we may have a hard time trusting people, if we just say, love God and let him work those things out, that's hard for us to say. You know, you as a parent, you're not just going to say that to your kids probably. So what we've done in the church a lot of times is we've come up with, love God, but here's how you do it. And we have a list of all the things you got to do. And many of us here kind of have tattooed in our hearts this list of things to do, which is not bad. It's not bad to have some idea of what a Christian lifestyle looks like. But the invitation of Jesus, I believe, for us this morning is to step back from that list even and say, can we look to lift to the top rank, to the highest place, loving God with our whole hearts, our whole minds, our whole souls, all that we are. And I recognize this morning as I say that there's probably a good amount of us here that your heart kind of sinks when I say that, because you're going like, here it is. It's like this love thing that I have a hard time putting my fingers around, and I have a hard time explaining it. And you feel disqualified, you feel defeated, you feel like you don't do it well. Maybe you've even been told by people you don't love very well. Well, God knows how to lead us in this thing. And to the degree that you feel defeated and that would make you feel like, I can't do this, in Jesus' name, he has a different way for you and for me. I just want to pray for us right now. God, I pray for any of us here that feel the weight of failure right now and feel just a sense of defeat, that we don't know how to love well, that loving is not something that is our highest gifting, God, and we almost wish that there was something else at the top of the list. I pray, Jesus, you'd break through that in your name. I pray that you'd come and that you would give a fresh start to every single one of us in this room. A fresh start to believe you to lead us in what this relationship of love is meant to look like. Break off disqualification and defeat in Jesus' name. Yeah, I have a couple of questions I want us to work through about making these statements about God, loving God being primary in our lives, and that may answer some of the things that we wrestle with. First thing I want to ask is Jesus right about what he said? Is Jesus right when he said that everything else in our lives hinges on our loving God? Is he right? Is that right in your experience? Is it right in my experience? You know, when you're loving God fully, are you a better husband or wife? When you're giving yourself to loving God fully, are you a better parent? Are you more patient with your kids when you're loving God fully? Are you softer toward your husband or your wife when you're loving God fully? Or when you're loving God with all that you are and seeking to do that, do you find it easier or harder to be disciplined in your personal life in the things that you're attempting to do? Or how about when you're loving God fully, or when I'm loving God fully, am I more or less likely to wander toward old sin habits and struggles? And I know those are questions that I'm kind of posing to you and to myself, And I have answers for those things. I'm less prone to wander toward sin struggles that have messed up my life when I'm loving God fully. When I'm giving myself to fully loving Him, I'm less prone to wander away. I am more softer. I'm more softer. There you go. I'm more soft toward my wife, toward people around me. When I'm loving God fully, the things that can get me ticked off, and there's plenty of things that can get me ticked off, whatever. There's plenty of things that can kind of bug me. When I'm really loving God fully, those things don't rush out of my mouth too quickly. I even find myself at times when I'm loving God with a whole heart, I'm able to submit to things that I don't love. Because that's not my nature. My nature is not to submit to things that I don't love. If I don't love it, I'm going to let you know about it, and I'm not going to do it. And when I'm loving God fully, that changes. That changes. I guess my question here is, can loving God really directly affect that much in our lives? And I think yes. I think yes. I think sometimes we spend too much time and energy dissecting and analyzing and studying about our struggles and issues, when sometimes, and it may complicate it, when sometimes the answer is simply love. You need to love God more. Sometimes I look back in my life and some of the journeys that I've been on where I fought different battles with sin and struggles and habits, and I think if I'd have spent a little more time being concerned about loving God instead of fighting sin, I think I'd have been a little farther down the line a little quicker. If the anchor in our lives is loving God with all that we are, if that's really the anchor and everything else is tethered to that, then there's a promise of life for us. And I believe that is true. I believe Jesus in that. I've seen that in my own life. I believe that. I think another question I would have here is, how do we come to love God with our whole heart? What does that look like? What does that mean? Does that mean that you got to go full time? Isn't that what Travis is? Travis is paid to love God full time. So that's what it means to love God fully, wholeheartedly? No, that's not what it's talking about at all. How do we as a people love God with everything that's in us? How do we build that relationship? I've got just a few little pointers to give you. None of these are terribly profound, but just things that I see throughout the Scriptures. The first thing that I would say we want to do if we really want to be people that are loving God with all that we are is we have to make room in our heart. We have to make room in our heart to love God fully. Do you know that your heart has a limited capacity to love? That's kind of what John the Apostle is getting at in 1 John chapter 2, verse 15. It says, don't love the world or the things in the world, or the love of the Father is not going to be in you. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that God doesn't love us when we love the world? No, it's not talking about that. It's talking about our love for the Father. So it says when we love the world and the things of the world, when that fills our lives, guess what it does? It squeezes out our ability to be able to love God. So one of the very first things we want to do, if we want to be someone who is learning to love God with a whole heart, we may need to break up with our old girlfriend, all right? There may need to be some things that have filled our hearts that we need to break up with. And it can, I don't know what it is for you. I know what some of those things are for me. It may be pleasure, it may be comfort, it may be materialism. There could be any list of things that could fill this. It could be anything. But if it's filling your heart, if your affections and love are already filled, if your life is already filled and your heart's already filled, then God's not going to be able to be taking that first place. So the first thing, we might need to make some room in our hearts to love God. We might need to be able to break off some love relationship with other things that are filling us up so that we can love Him fully. Second thing is we can make it a priority, meaning we can be intentional about that. That we can say, God, I want to be a person that loves you with my whole heart. There's something about that, being intentional about our lives by a choice of our will to say, I want to put that to first place in my life. And we're going to take a little bit of time in a couple minutes here just to do that together, to break off anything that's already filling our hearts too much, and to be able to make it a priority, to say, I want to move that to top rank in my life. Another thing that we can do to really help us to learn to love God with everything that we are is we can spend time. Spend time. Personal time spent with our kind, loving, and good King will absolutely grow us in love with Him. And I'm not just talking about reading books about God, which that's all right. That may be a part of how you do it. That can be. But I mean spending time with Him. You know, if somebody asks how we're going to build a relationship and we want to grow in a love relationship with someone here, we pretty much know what that means. It's not all that different. It's spending time. Spending time. It's giving our affections over. And so one of the ways that we can grow in our love relationship with God is spending time with Him. Spending time in His Word, looking for Him. I love studying the Word to gain things here in your brain and to see how the whole historical thing works, but it's also a beautiful thing to spend time in the Word of God simply looking for the heart of God, the heart of a Father that's looking for you. Spend time in prayer. Spend time in meditation. I think another thing we can do is we can give our attention. Giving our attention. We can have such a habit of compartmentalizing our spiritual lives so that like when we think of spiritual things like loving God, it like fits either to this half-hour slot in the morning or a certain day of the week like Sunday. And I think it'd be great for us to break those things down and look to give God our attention more fully. As I'm driving to work, that my mind is on Him. As I'm in the midst of what I'm doing, my mind is on Him. I can have conversation with Him. Knowing that His eye is always on me, I'm glancing back toward Him, saying, okay, God, thank you that you're with me. I recognize it. I give you my attention. Another thing we can do is join with others to love God in fellowship. That's one of the beautiful things that we can do to be able to grow our love relationship with God. You get around other people that are loving God, and you grow in that. You learn by doing that. You know, that's one of the things that this month we've actually set aside the remaining Thursdays in January. Beginning this Thursday, we've set them aside as prayer and worship nights. And we're doing it specifically to give us room and space to be able to grow our love for God, to be able to put the first commandment to first place in our lives. So I want to invite you to join us. Join us as we gather together as a family to love God together and to see the first commandment move to first place. So on Thursday night, starting this Thursday, 6:30 to 8 p.m., right here, we're going to be gathering to worship Jesus, to pray, to spend time letting God, nurturing that whole place of love, our love relationship with God. You know, over the years, one of my personal pet peeves has been to ask people pretty regularly if they're loving Jesus. And if you've known me very long, you've probably had me ask you that. And some people have been kind of perturbed by that because they're like, what are you asking me a goofy question like that? And I'll be honest with you. Part of it's because I care about if you're loving Jesus. Part of it. Part of it is because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm this task-oriented guy, and that's become a kind of regular part of my habit because it helps remind me of what really counts. It reminds me that, man, if I'm not loving Jesus in what I'm doing, no matter what ministry stuff it is, if I'm not loving Jesus, then it's going to be empty stuff. I'm just going through the motions. And so sometimes if I've asked you that, and it's bothered you, I'm sorry, but that really is, there's so much there for us to grasp. You know, I'm grateful that the real anchor of our salvation is the great love of God toward us. I am so grateful. I am so glad that we can abide in this great love of God for us. But I recognize in my life, if my life is going to be fruitful and full of life, I'm also involved in this love relationship with Him. And if my love for Jesus is fading, then my Christian walk feels pretty crummy. God hasn't changed. He's still for me. He's still going to hold on to me. But we're not talking here about let's just how to get through. What is God's plan for us? It's something a lot bigger than just us surviving. You know, one of the beautiful traits about our Father and our King is that he promises us that as we draw near him, that he'll do what? He'll come near to us. That's a beautiful promise of the Lord. And what that means is it means for people like me, and it's not just a guy thing, but maybe guys tend toward having a greater struggle in this area. If you're like me, though, and it's like, man, I'm not really sure how this love kind of thing really pulls off, the great news is that as we step forward, even in our feeble weakness and not knowing what we're doing, God comes running toward us. He's the one that says, I come to lead you in this dance. I come to lead you in this thing. This thing about having a full love relationship with me is my idea, and I've got it down. You don't have to have it all figured out. Step into me. Step toward me. Be intentional about it, and I'll lead you in this dance.
Thanks for listening. We want to be a resource for you as you walk with Jesus. So please connect with us at radiantvisalia.com. Until next time.
There is a heavenly city that I'm compelled to find. Though I love the flowers and trees and the smell of the grinding sea and all the beautiful things here in life. And I